Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the January 2021 session of the Botanical Gardens Learn and Grow series. I'm Judith Alberts. I chair the board of directors for the garden. A little bit of housekeeping. Yes, we're recording this session, and everyone who registered will receive a link to the replay within 48 hours, and it'll be posted on YouTube. Please make sure your microphone is turned off. And a little bit of a recommendation, you may want to actually turn off your video camera in case you fall asleep. It's always embarrassing when people nod off in the middle of a presentation. We're going to use the chat box for questions, and our speaker will answer them at the end. And bear with us if we run into technical glitches. Hey, we're volunteers. So I know that many of you are friends of both Peggy and myself, and you know all about the garden, but I am seeing all kinds of names, and we've actually gone international. We have someone who has joined us from Canada. So a little bit about the Botanical Garden. First thing to know is that it's free to visit us, and it's open from 7 a.m. until dusk. It's a tiny garden, only 2 acres, and the traffic circle on the road to the parking lot at Freedom Park. But there's a lot packed into those 2 acres. 18 different types of habitat, such as a wildflower meadow, woodlands, 3 different types of wetlands, a succulents rock garden, iris garden, a calcareous ravine model, native grasses, to name just a few. And we are planning some things for 2021, so stay tuned. Our garden is intentionally more natural than what you would expect when you hear the words botanical garden. It is most definitely not manicured or highly manicured. I call it a wild child. It has a strong emphasis on native plants to support pollinators, and it is officially registered as Monarch Butterfly Way Station number 3394. This is the garden in winter. This was taken about a week ago. Stems and stalks are deliberately left standing to provide winter shelter and food for birds and other wildlife. The garden's mission is to demonstrate environmentally responsible and sustainable gardening and to offer education on related topics. Everything in the garden is tended by a team of dedicated volunteers, and we do it on a slim budget, so here comes the pitch. Ways that you can support the Botanical Garden, because we are a 501c3 nonprofit. We receive no funding from any level of the government. Our Learn and Grow programs are free. Under normal circumstances, the donation jar at the door would certainly be filled. So I invite you to visit our virtual Learn and Grow donations jar. There'll be a link in the follow-up email for the recording. And I actually saw a membership come through already this morning and a renewal. So thank you very, very much. I do appreciate that on behalf of the garden. If you order bulbs from Brent and Becky's, start at bloomandbucks.com, and you can designate, there are several nonprofits that participate, and we actually received a check for $296 and change this past, I think it came in at the end of December, because they donate 25% of your order. So we appreciate that. And if you shop on Amazon, start at smile.amazon.com, and a small portion, it is a small portion, but every little bit helps. And when we started tracking our Smile supporters, we had 5, count them 5, and I know that I was one of them, 5 people that supported us, and now we are up to 19. I'm so excited. I'm so excited. So that means we will be getting a check. It may be small, but we will be getting a check in February. You will find the Botanical Garden at williamsburgbbotanicalgarden.org and on Facebook. And if you are a milkweed crusader, or a monarch crusader, I should say, please join us on our Milkweed Connection group on Facebook. We are also on YouTube. Coming events. Next month, February 20th, we are going to have Justin Diaz, who is a local farmer, master gardener. He's going to talk about composting. And he's going to do a back-to-back performance on March 20th with how to start seeds successfully. On April 17th, we're going to have a wildlife biologist who's going to talk to us about amphibians, and yes, it includes snakes. The last item before I introduce our speaker today is to remind master gardeners and naturalists that this counts as continuing education. So Peggy Kropp is a landscape designer who's been working in the Williamsburg, Virginia area since 1993. She holds a landscape specialist certificate from George Washington University, is a certified and active member of the Virginia Society of Landscape Designers, and a Virginia Master Gardener and speaker. She has also served on the Botanical Gardens Board for many years and is one of our most ardent supporters. An award-winning designer, her landscapes have been on tour during historic Garden Week of Virginia, Ford's Colony, Hidden Treasures Garden Tour, and Parade of Homes. Featured also in the Daily Press, Hampton Roads Gardening Magazine, the Gazette, Southern Living Magazine. Here is her website, Heart's Ease Landscape and Garden Design. You can also find her on Facebook. She is a frequent speaker for local garden clubs, horticultural events, and does part of the training for the Master Gardeners training class. So I'm going to stop my share. Please welcome Peggy Kropp. Take it away, Peggy.
Thank you. All right, we have to figure out how we're going to do. Here we go, Judith.
All right.
Always takes a second.
It always does. I will watch the waiting room.
Okay. Okay. Hopefully this is it.
All right.
If anybody has any problem or issue, you can't see, you can't hear me, please contact Judith
Via
through the
chat.
little chat, typing and video chat, and she can jump in and alert me if I need to do something differently. Good morning, everyone. Go ahead. Am I good?
I just wanted to say, yes, you're good.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Thank you all for being here today. I greatly appreciate it. This is a topic that is near and dear to my heart. And so I want to share the information with you because I think it's something that's very important for all of us who are gardeners to be aware of and be thinking of while we're gardening. I'm going to start today by talking a little bit about what pollinators are, what the problem is, and then what we can do to try to make a little bit of difference in what's happening here in the world. Pollinators from the Master Gardener Handbook are wildlife species that move pollen from the flowers of male to female plants while they're traveling in search of food and nectar and pollen or other insects to eat. Pollinators are many things. They include hummingbirds, butterflies, moths, bees, beetles, all species of insects, and some species of bats. And why is this important? It's important because over 85% of flowering plants require an animal, and it's usually an insect that we call a pollinator, to move pollen around. And of course, that's where our food supply comes from. Now, most people, when you say pollinator, the first thing they think of are honeybees. And honeybees, of course, are an extremely important pollinator. There's been a lot of publicity in the last number of years. You've heard things like colony collapse disease, varroa mites, all kinds of things have been impacting honeybees, some of which are understood and many of which really still aren't understood. One thing you can do to help the honeybees in your area is support local farmers, local beekeepers, local honey producers, because they're on the first line of defense of the pollinator problems, and they're fighting very hard to keep their honeybees happy and healthy. But what most people don't realize is honeybees are not a native insect. They are a non-native species. But we have over 4,000 different species of native bees in the United States that help pollinate wildflowers and crops. And most people are not aware of this. And if you put a little pollinator garden in your yard, you will quickly start to discover how many fascinating and amazing bees there are in the world beyond just honeybees. So this is an extremely important part of why I hope you will all start implementing some of the suggestions and ideas that I'll be talking about today. But other beautiful critters that are considered pollinators, things like moths, which often we don't see because they typically are out and about during the evening and at night. The beautiful Luna moth, and I've taken most of the pictures you will see today. I have taken many of them in my little habitat garden. So you will see, if you build it, they will absolutely come. So on the left-hand side is Luna moth. On the right-hand side is the beautiful little hummingbird moth that actually looks like a little hummingbird zooming around. It's really loads of fun for children to see these. Dragonflies, I love dragonflies. So many different beautiful types, sizes, shapes, colors of dragonflies, wonderful pollinators in a garden. And of course, you know, the queen of the garden, the queen of the pollinator garden are butterflies. Beautiful, showy, so many different species, but that's what attracts most of us to put in pollinator gardens to begin with. But it isn't just insects that are impacted in the issues that we're having today with pollinators and the problems that we're having with insects and pollinators. There are many, many other species are affected. Things like turtles and water creatures, and of course, birds. I saw this little poster recently on a Facebook page I follow. It's called Pollinator Friendly Yards on Facebook. And I would say, if you're interested in this topic, and you're on Facebook, it's a great little site to follow. It's a woman out of the Atlanta, Georgia area who posts some really interesting things. But I love this because this, to me, captures the essence of why what we're doing is important. All your life, you've been told these are bugs, but they're not. They're bird food. And so when we kill insects, we're taking food away from birds. And it's amazing how many people don't connect the dots in terms of what is happening in the outdoor world. Case in point, not very long ago, I was doing a consultation in a woman's yard, and we were walking around, and she wanted some ideas to change plants and do whatever. And I noticed she had a lot of bird feeders and bird houses in her yard. And while we were talking, a little truck pulled up to the house, and out jumped a pest control man. And out he came with his spray equipment, and he went around to the back of the house. And I said to her, I'm just curious, what is he doing? What are you spraying? And she looked at me and shrugged her shoulders, and she said, I don't know, bugs, I guess. and I was a little perplexed. So when the exterminator came back around to the front of the house, I said, excuse me, do you mind my asking what you were spraying? And he said, well, this trip, I'm spraying for spiders and crickets. And I looked at my client and I said, now, do you realize birds eat spiders and crickets? And she looked at me with just a sort of blank look on her face, like she had absolutely no idea what birds really ate beyond the bird seed that she put in her feeders. And so this is part of the problem. We just don't understand how nature is connected. And that's something that we constantly need, that I try to educate my clients when I'm designing gardens for them, how important, the whole web of life is, and we're all interconnected. And we really need to be aware that anything we do in our yards will affect something else down the road. So why are pollinators disappearing, and why should we be concerned? There are several basic reasons, some of which we understand and others that we still don't understand. We know insects like the honeybees are prone to diseases, other pests. They have genetic issues that make them susceptible. Insects are all exposed to pesticides. Climate change and weather has great influence on insects, and we still don't really understand how climate change is affecting our world, us, the insects that are all around us. We know it is, but we don't quite understand how that is. And of course, top of the list probably is reduced habitat, which leads to poor nutrition. The insects just don't have the places to live that they used to have, nor do the birds. So what makes a healthy natural habitat? What's a positive thing to aim for that's going to keep our world in balance? And this is a little slide that I found through Cornell and geared toward birds, but it's really all birds and insects. And when you look at a natural habitat, what you see is layers, or they call it stories, the story of stories. You have an overstory, a midstory, and an understory. The overstory is the large, tall trees, the things like oaks and maples and pines and sycamores. Those are the large trees, which provide both food and habitat for all these little living creatures. Then you have the mid-story, which is middle-sized trees and large shrubs. That's where our dogwoods and our redbuds and serviceberries and large shrubs like viburnums, that kind of thing. And those are critical for the same reasons. And then you have your understory, which is the plants that are growing on the ground, and that would be native perennials, ornamental grasses, things like ferns. So basically what we're looking for in a healthy natural habit are these three layers, and that's something that we're going to try to want to replicate in our own yards. When I saw this photograph a number of years ago in National Geographic magazine, I just could hardly believe this was real. I'm wondering if anybody has any idea where this is, but this is growth and development outside Las Vegas, Nevada. This is Henderson, Nevada, one of the fastest growing counties, cities, probably in the country, or was a few years ago. And if you take a look at this, I mean, at one point, not too many years ago, this was nothing but desert. Now it's nothing but houses stacked on top of each other as far as the eye can see. And the houses, if you look at the sizes of the lots, the house takes up, it looks to me like 80 or almost 90% of the land that it's built on. So you have huge houses on tiny, tiny little lots where there's very little space. I don't even virtually see a tree when I look at this picture, but even for grass or plants of any kind. So if you think, well, thank goodness we don't live in Henderson, Nevada, we're not too far from that when you look at places right here in Virginia. This is a picture taken in Stafford County, Virginia, which is Northern Virginia, not far from Washington. Typical housing development in that neck of the woods. There's a little more space between the houses, but again, large houses on small lots. And so much of development is based on money and trying to fit the most number of houses that's possible on whatever piece of land is available. So lots are getting smaller and houses are getting bigger. And then if you think, well, that's why I moved out of Northern Virginia and moved down here to Williamsburg and James City County, where it's much more open and much more rural. Yes, it is, but that's changing too. James City is one of the fastest growing counties in Virginia. And this is a development in James City County, and doesn't look an awful lot different from the previous picture we looked at. So growth and development are happening everywhere. And every kind of development, whether you call it good development or bad development, it all destroys habitat, and it creates impervious surfaces that lead to runoff and erosion and water pollution. And that's why in our area, in our county, you're starting to see all of these retention and detention ponds popping up everywhere. And I'll discuss that a little further. So remember this picture, but this is typically what they look like. And this is one just not very far down the road from me in Williamsburg. And you can see it's a hole in the ground where all the drainage collects. And then this particular one is just surrounded by turf grass and a few plants, and which I think is a big mistake. And I will discuss that a little bit further. So that's the development that's going on. And sometimes it sneaks up on us and we just aren't as aware of it as maybe we need to be. Another huge issue is the use of pesticides and chemicals in both agriculture and home gardening. And there are places around the country, there are states, especially in the Midwest, where grain is grown and soybeans and corn, and thousands and thousands of acres are grown in just one particular crop. And they're grown using tremendous amounts of chemicals to keep down the weeds. And so the use of pesticides and monocultures is its own issue because there are no habitats in a monoculture. There's one particular plant and that's all for thousands of acres. And that's kind of shocking when you look at slides of what's happening in the Midwest of the country. But the statistics tell us that home gardeners use more pesticides and chemicals than farmers do. And so we all need to be extremely careful about what we put on our gardens and in our yards, and even the plants that we buy, because a lot of the plants, the flowers, the herbs, the shrubs, the things that we buy from garden centers and nurseries are treated with chemicals. And you may have heard a few years ago, there was a big uproar over the use of a particular chemical called neonics or neonicotinoids. And a lot of plants are treated with those, but they're a systemic pesticide and they're held within the plant. So you buy the plant, you bring it home, you plant it in your yard, and when insects feed on those plants, they are actually ingesting the insecticides that were put on by the grower of the plant before you even bought it. So there are groups that are trying to make people much more aware of those issues. So that's something to be very careful of. And of course, I'm hoping that everybody is leaning more and more to using fewer chemicals, using organic chemicals and pesticides if you need to use a chemical at all. Another problem is that as gardeners, we are planting many invasive and exotic species that crowd out our native plants. On the left, you'll see a picture of kudzu, and kudzu is known as the plant that's taken over the South, and it has control, and it did a very good job of that, but it did too good of a job, and it has now taken over. And there's this is not James City County, but if you come up toward Toano at the intersection of Croker Road and Richmond Road, where the CNF Bank is, there's been a big empty lot across the road for many years, which is still empty. But you will see kudzu just like this, that's taken over acres, crawled up into the trees. It's really unbelievable how quickly that grows. Bamboo is another example. It's an Asian plant. It's very aggressive, and once you have it, it's almost impossible to get rid of. So these are plants that are absolutely, in many states, prohibited and illegal from planting. But there are a lot, garden centers are now considered by biologists and botanists to be exotic invasive plants, and they're still for sale. And I would guess probably, I would say 70%, if not more, maybe even 80% of most of the plants that I see in local nurseries and garden centers are not native plants. They are non-native plants. Most of them come from Asia, from Turkey, Japan, China, and they've been coming over for years. We love what's different and unusual. The plants that we see growing around us in the woods, we don't value, but it's interesting how over in other countries, American natives are highly valued. Those are their exotic plants that they're buying, whereas here we're buying things like barberry, English ivy, many, many, many plants that are still available. And one of the big problems, if not the biggest problem I think we have as Americans, is what I call our landscape aesthetic. We love mowed lawns and neat and tidy landscapes. And I would say, as a landscape designer, probably the #1 phrase I have heard over the years when I meet with clients and I ask how they want their yard to look, neat and tidy is probably the #1 phrase that I have heard. You know, people want to be good citizens. Many people here in Williamsburg live in a development that often has an HOA, and the HOA, wants people to keep their properties neat and tidy, so everybody's property value stays up. And in a typical development, this is generally what you see. This is a new home in a development in Williamsburg, and you'll get a house, you'll get all the trees. Many of the trees will have been removed, if not all. It's much easier for builders to build when they have a clean slate rather than working around existing trees. So you get a yard with almost no native trees. It's cheap to fill it with turf grass. And then if you're lucky, you get a few plants around the house. And if you're extremely lucky, you get a tree to start with. And that's absolutely typical for many of the new neighborhoods in Williamsburg. But the truth is that nature likes things that are a little messy. So it's time that we start thinking a little differently about what we think is a good thing, and maybe start thinking about some more important issues. And instead of having our yards look just beautiful, we think about how we can make our yards both beautiful and helpful. So I personally think we need a whole new aesthetic about what makes a landscape pretty, beautiful, attractive. When I went through design school 30 years ago, the emphasis was on aesthetics. The idea was that as landscape designers, we were to create functional yards for people, as well as attractive yards and low maintenance yards. And that involved at the time a lot of non-native plants that you can prune, that grow slowly, that don't have any insect problems, that don't get diseases. And that was the garden aesthetic of the time. And I honestly don't remember taking any classes 30 years ago in environmental gardening and habitat gardening and gardening for the wildlife around us, or to make the planet a better place. That just wasn't on the radar then, but that's changing, thankfully. And there are many wonderful, wonderful companies and wonderful sites now that you can get involved in, that you can do some research on, that are working very hard to educate people about how important this is. So instead of the picture on the left, which is sort of typical subdivision landscaping, big house, lots of turf grass that needs to be mowed, takes a lot of gas, takes a lot of time, why not think about landscaping our properties with less grass, with more plants? They don't all have to be native plants. We can use a combination. I'm a strong believer in compromise. I feel it's better to get people to plant plants, period, let alone try to struggle to convince them that native plants are what they need when they're not used to native plants. It's kind of a slow educational process. But on a property like this on the right, this was one of my clients a number of years ago. On a sloped lot, it made no sense to have grass on the slope. It would have been a nightmare. So we did a few retaining walls. We added a lot of pollinator plants, took care of the drainage with a little bit of rock, used native trees along with some non-natives, lots of grasses. But again, the idea being more plants and less turf grass. This is the development I work in all the time on the left. And I see this all the time, lots of turf grass, small beds with what people perceive as something very low maintenance, because again, people, ease of maintenance or the ability to hire somebody else to take care of your yard has become the norm. And so small beds with just gravel in them, which people don't have to replace, like mulch has to be replaced on a regular basis. But I see this kind of thing popping up all the time. And it's not a useful habitat, but it's also not attractive to my eye. So instead of the photo on the left, why not take that gravel bed and put some beautiful pollinator plants in it? And have something that's healthy and attractive and beautiful. Instead of this on the left, which I see all the time, I call it landscaping with green meatballs and red meatballs. And I have nothing wrong with plants like boxwoods that are sort of the king of green meatballs. I use green meatballs in a lot of my landscapes. These are also Nandina, which are pruned into little red meatballs. But there's a whole world of plants other than those plants that can be used. Everything doesn't have to be trimmed to within an inch of its life and look like a green meatball to look neat and tidy, and I'll get into that a little bit later. But why not take a bed like that and do something like this lovely little butterfly garden? I took a picture of this out on the Eastern Shore in Kiptopee, and it's a nice sort of little small circular garden filled with native and butterfly plants. And it's a wonderful, attractive little garden, which could look very pretty in almost any development. And this is something I try to do in my clients' yards, is to convince them to minimize the amount of turf grass, and let's make the planting beds extra deep, extra wide, and put in a combination of both native and non-native plants So we have more habitat and something that's prettier. And in many ways, less maintenance than weekly mowing. I also think that communities, counties, jurisdictions are missing the mark by not doing more in a lot of the areas around the community. Every community has median plantings, and in a lot of the medians, you will see often it's nothing but turf grass. And so you'll see the county mowers out there every week in the summertime mowing under dangerous conditions because they're in the middle of busy roads trying to mow these median strips. Well, why not take the median strips, fill them with beautiful plants, native grasses, things that maybe only need to be maintained once or twice a year, things that will attract pollinators, insects, and bees, and look beautiful. So that's an area I think that local jurisdictions, with some prodding from people in the community, might be very willing to make a difference. Here's that picture I showed you on the left earlier of the retention pond. I sketched a little kind of curvy bed around it, and why not take retention ponds, put wide 30, 40-foot buffers around them, like is on the photo on the right, fill them with pollinator plants, grasses, small shrubs, pollinators, which will filter all the water, all the runoff before it gets down into the retention pond, which is part of the purpose and really how retention ponds should be built. The one on the left involves tremendous amount of maintenance and mowing, which I would think no development would want to do, not to mention because it's turf grass, it's probably being sprayed or fertilized in some way, and all those chemicals run down the hill in a rain and pollute the water. So by adding a huge buffer, adding many more plants, the water at the bottom will be much cleaner and can also become a wonderful habitat for insects and things like dragonflies and critters that love that kind of a moist, wet environment. If you are interested, actually, I am doing a little project with James City County this spring. We did a little mini project in Veterans Park in the fall, and we upgraded the planting in a little rain garden near the parking lot, and had a group of volunteers come out and help to plant. This one is going to be a much bigger planting. It's a narrow retention drainage area that right now is a ditch with grass around it that looks extremely unattractive. So I've designed it to become a pollinator garden similar to what you see here. And sometime in the spring, you will start to see some publicity coming out when we've chosen a date and we're ready to do it. We'll be looking for volunteers in James City County to come out and help plant. But also what we're really looking for is organizations maybe like Master Naturalists who might be interested in taking ownership of the project and coming out on a regular basis, maybe monthly, and checking the plants, pulling out some weeds. If something has died, replacing it, doing a little pruning, but just doing the ongoing maintenance because the county crews are overwhelmed. They do not have extra time to do this kind of maintenance. So if you're interested, you can contact me or you can contact the Stormwater Division of James City County, Pat Manichino, and they're sponsoring the project and paying for it all. And we'll be doing something fun to be a demonstration garden to show people how this works and how it can happen. So I'm looking forward to that. So again, what makes a yard a habitat? Bringing some of these concepts into our own backyards. There are really only 3 or 4 very simple things that you can do that it takes to turn a backyard into a habitat. One is food, next is water, then there's shelter and plant diversity. And if you look at this little photograph, you can see it sort of mimics the picture I showed you earlier about the layers, the growing in layers. So you have tall trees, you have medium trees, and you have lower plants on the ground. So food is often the plants that grow, it's the fruit, it's the pollen, sometimes it's the leaves themselves that the critters are eating. It's other insects that are attracted to the garden, and it's also often food that we put out. We put out bird feeders with bird seed, with mealworms. All of those things are attracting birds and other critters into the garden. Water is critical. All of these critters need water, whether it's a little pond, whether it's a bird bath. If you can put something in it to make the water move and create some sound, you're going to attract many, many, many more birds to the sound of running water. You can buy little pumps that you can pop in a bird feeder. Even if it's just a dish that you keep water in, or a puddle, fresh, clean water is critical in a wildlife habitat. Then, of course, there's shelter. All of these critters need a place to hide from predators, to build their nests, to lay their eggs. And again, that's where putting bird houses, bird boxes, you can put butterfly boxes, all kinds of things that you can find at your local bird store. They have all kinds of wonderful pollinator boxes. You can buy mason bee boxes and all sorts of things. So those shelter aspects of a garden are critical. And then last is plant diversity. It's planting plants that are blooming at different times of the year, that have 4-season interest. Some are evergreen, some are deciduous, some that bloom in the spring, some bloom in the fall. So you want plants that are blooming at different times of the year so that you can provide food and habitat for birds and other critters all 4 seasons of the year. And something that's been getting a lot of publicity lately, there is a campaign out there, and this is another wonderful organization, Wild Seed Project. They have a campaign called Leave the Leaves. And what they're trying to teach people is, in the fall, do not have someone come in, rake up all your leaves, put them in plastic bags, put them out by the curb so that it will then disappear and hopefully be recycled, but not necessarily. Leaves are a very important part of the habitat concept. They sustain birds and all kinds of critters over the winter. Lots of little critters have eggs that are hidden in leaf litter and leaf mulch. It warms the ground so that insects that burrow into the ground and winter over can stay warmer. It insulates the roots of plants. It helps build the soil. So leaves are an absolute critical part of habitat. And they are Mother Nature's mulch. You know, it's amazing to me how many clients I have that pay people in the fall to get rid of all their leaves, and then they hire somebody to spread acres and acres of mulch. It just doesn't make any sense. We here on our property, we have loads of leaves. Shredded leaves is my mulch of choice for all my garden beds, and especially my perennial beds. Perennials really don't like heavy hardwood mulch. It crusts over, it doesn't let them seed very easily, it smothers them. So I would say if you have access to leaves, keep them and use them as mulch. It is Mother Nature's mulch. Now, how you grow a pollinator-friendly yard without upsetting your neighbors and your HOA? That's one of the first questions people always ask me. And even though this is what every HOA loves to see in their subdivisions, this is definitely not a pollinator habitat. You have plants that don't bloom. They have no flowers. They're pruned to 1 inch of their lives. You have huge expanses of turf grass, which is probably heavily fertilized and sprayed with pesticides to keep the critters out. This is not a pollinator habitat. But on the other hand, a habitat garden doesn't have to look like this. And I think this is the big fear of every homeowners association, is that if you allow what people are calling a wildlife habitat, this is what everybody's yard is going to look like. So what I want to focus on today is showing you how you can have a lovely habitat garden and keep your neighbors and your HOA happy. I work in lots of subdivisions in the county all over, and most all of them have an HOA, so I deal with this all of the time, and I've learned some tips and tricks to make it possible. Here's a yard that I did some years ago. It's out on the river in First Colony, and clients had built this lovely house, and I had helped them design a previous home somewhere else in Williamsburg. And when she built this, she was very interested in pollinators and habitats. But again, like most people, does not have unlimited time. She and her husband both work. They couldn't be out there gardening. So I used a combination of low maintenance, non-native plants, but used as many native plants as I could where it was possible and where it looked appropriate. So you'll see here on the left, one of the big problems they had was drainage. They had to put in a big circle driveway, which again was a lot of impervious pavement. The water had to go somewhere. It all ended up in that circle in the middle of the yard. And so that was something that we addressed. On the right-hand side, you'll see after picture on the left is before. She had no shrubbery around the house whatsoever, no plantings. We put a lot of plantings in there. We did a combination of native and non-native. I chose a lot of grasses because I know the birds love to eat the grasses in the fall. And I tell my clients, don't cut your grasses down early in the fall. Wait until very early in the spring when they just start. You see the new growth popping up. Leave the seed pods all through the winter so the birds and the critters who lay their eggs on the stems have time to hatch. But you'll see the picture on the right is some shrubbery afterwards. And then that's the circle in the middle of the driveway, which we took care of some of the drainage with some grading issues. We put a river birch there to help suck up all the extra water. And I wish I had taken this picture a few weeks sooner, but we filled it with pollinator plants like black-eyed Susans, Rudbeckia, and this is just as they've gone past. But when they're blooming, they're a great pollinator plant, and then the cones form seeds that the birds absolutely adore. So you can see that she's put in this little garden. You can see she's got a bird house. She has a butterfly house. On other places, not a native plant, but a fabulous pollinator plant. We used a lot of black-eyed Susans. We put in verbena. Native beautyberry we used along the perimeter, which is a fabulously beautiful native. Maiden grasses I used, but now if I were to do it again, I would use some of the more native grasses. Maiden grass is an Asian grass. It's a beautiful grass and I still use it, but now I lean toward more of the native grasses just to use as many natives as possible. And then again, on the right, some beautiful native honeysuckle, not the Japanese. This is our natives that hummingbirds adore. And then because she used food, water, shelter, diversity, she was able to get her yard certified through the National Wildlife Federation as a certified wildlife habitat. This is very easy to do. It just involves going online, filling out some simple paperwork. I think it's $20 to get certified, and then you have a choice of different signs that you can purchase to put in the yard and let your neighbors know that you are concerned about the environment and that your yard is a wildlife habitat, and that's why maybe it doesn't look like every other yard in the neighborhood, but you are doing it for a purpose. This is another yard. This is a friend of mine, a master naturalist here in James City County. And her yard is in a lovely big development here in Williamsburg. And, you know, from the front of the yard, it looks like it blends in perfectly well with every other house on the street. She has a few more plants than most people do, but other than that, it looks just like every other well-maintained yard in the neighborhood. With her backyard, though, it's a little bit different. What she has done is exactly what I usually recommend to Mike in the back. She's created a beautiful, curvy bed of grass, just enough to be functional and get around, but that allowed her to have extra deep planting beds, both along the house and along the natural area in the back. She's put in all kinds of both native and non-native plants that are great pollinator plants, and there are lots of non-natives that are wonderful pollinator plants. She's put in loads of bird feeders, bird houses. She has, I love her little bird bath. She's got one of those little, and I think it's a little solar pump that pumps water up, and you get a little waterfall effect, and it makes noise, and boy, does that attract the birds and the critters, because they really can hear that there's running water. And you can see she kept the typical kind of green or gold meatball shrubs that were originally planted when she moved in, and she underplanted them with all kinds of pollinator and native perennials, which filled in the beds, covered up the mulch, and now she has lots more habitat in her existing beds. And then she also put some, you know, cute focal points around the yard. She's a real nature lover. And she also had her yard certified, you can see, as a wildlife habitat garden. This is a neighborhood I do a tremendous amount of work in and have for 30 years. This is Fort Colony. This is a client of mine who downsized, built another house. Unfortunately, her downsizing ended up being building a fairly nice size, but on a smaller lot. And she's an avid gardener and never has enough space to plant. So basically what we did here was we designed a yard that fit in the character of the development. But basically what we did was created a series of pathways around the yard for her to access, and then everything else in the yard was a planting bed. And then she has come back and filled all the spaces with plants, a combination of bulbs and perennials and small shrubs and all the kinds of plants that she adores. Not all native, but many are, and many are wonderful perennials. On the left, you'll see we did this formal little garden in the front. We created one big pathway that goes to the front door. We created a secondary pathway to this little formal area, which I thought probably we might put some boxwoods in just as a little nod to the neighborhood and her husband, who likes a little more formal gardens. But she took over that little spot as well, and she fills it with whatever her heart's desire. And this is Mitzi standing in front of her little garden. It's all fenced in with a garden. This particular neighborhood requires that people either put in fences or they put in hedges to enclose their yards. And you can see she has filled every single inch with some wonderful, interesting, amazing plant. And she's a happy gardener. This is another development outside of Williamsburg. These were clients who had a lovely big house on just a large front yard that was nothing but turf grass. And it took me a bit to educate him as to how he did not need to have 100% turf grass in his front yard. Maybe we can introduce some other things. So I convinced him finally to let's put in some nice big kidney-shaped beds. We added some native trees. We added some nice boulders, some stone walls. And then where I could, I filled in with lots of pollinator plants, perennials. We used river birch, which is a native tree. And so even though he still has and is happy with a lot of turf grass, we've tried to sneak in as many things as we possibly can. This is a neighborhood, the Vineyards, a very lovely neighborhood in Williamsburg with an HOA. When I was called out to this job, these people had a lovely pool, and they also had a difficult situation in their backyard, which is they had a RPA buffer, which is a resource protection area, which has very strict rules and regulations of what can and cannot be done in that yard. So when I first came to look at it, looking down from their main view, which is the deck of the second floor of their house, they had a lovely pool. They had a fenced-in yard. Behind the fence is wetlands and RPA buffer, but they had the oddest conglomeration of boxwoods and plants and just brown mulch, ugly brown mulch filling up that whole backyard. So we talked about what some possibilities were. She happened to have a lot of stonework in her yard that was left over. She had some stone projects done a number of years ago by someone who did not do a very good job. So I had recommended a contractor. We came in, we read all that, but we had leftover stone. So I recommended to her, we didn't mortar it in place so water could percolate. We created a beautiful pathway that went all the way back to that gate, which made sense to me. And you can see on the right, we're starting to put in a permeable stone pathway. We took out all the plantings, moved them other places, and then we filled in with native plants, dwarf Yopon hollies, verbena, coreopsis, and they had an old teak bench, and I suggested they paint it some wonderful bright color, which they did, which makes it the top of the yard. And then she had this amazing, you can see on the right, they then put out there in the yard, which to me is the pièce de résistance. So we have added a lot more perennial plants in that backyard, and they love their perennial garden. This is another yard in that particular development. Again, you can see large, very formal houses. My client is on the left-hand side, and they wanted to do more of a buffer between them and their next door neighbor on the right. So their next door neighbor had some small little azaleas, I think is what those were. So we came into my client's yard. We added a nice wide buffer. We put some nice big fat ornamental grasses, which again create seed pods that in the winter are great food for birds. And we filled in with lantana, and she put a birdhouse, and we have other pollinator plants in there. So now not only does she have a better buffer between her and her neighbor's yard, she has a little habitat garden as well. This is Ford's Colony again. This is a small little habitat garden. On the left-hand side, habitat garden doesn't have to be big, but this is a little area in a place where this client comes and goes every day. We added some stonework to go from another location, cross over the existing walkway and up to the back steps. So she passes through this little area every single day. And so that's the area. We put a water feature. We filled it with both native and non-native perennials and pollinator plants. And so she has a cute little pollinator garden right there where she is. The right is one of my clients who lives on a golf course pond. And again, it's an RPA buffer, so you have to be very careful what you put there, and you don't want chemicals and pesticides running down into the water. But we have a nice little island bed there with some boulders for accent, some nice big grasses that are low maintenance and very deer resistant. And we filled it with lots of pollinator plants. She has a birdhouse and, of course, a little bird bath for a water feature. In Kingsmill, another development, one of the original in Williamsburg, very strict HOA requirements. This is a little backyard garden, terrible deer problem in Kingsmill, but this little backyard is fenced. And so this client, who was one of our master gardeners, he filled it with all kinds of perennials that bloom 4 different seasons. He put in bird houses and butterfly houses, and he's got a lovely little, as well as bird baths. So he also has a lovely little wildlife pollinator habitat in a very small, very fenced in formal yard. The key to this backyard, which gives it, makes it look more neat and tidy, is structure. The more structural elements like pathways, like fences that you can put in a garden, the more cohesive it looks and the more planned it is, and the wilder you can get with your plants. Because in the winter time, when all the plants kind of disappear, you still have these strong structural elements which make the garden look attractive. It's what you will read garden articles, they call it the bones of the garden. It's the plants and the structural elements that hold it through the winter and make it look attractive. This is a beautiful home, not in an HOA development, out actually not very far from where I live in the country. I did not do the landscape design on this. I wish I had, but they are friends of ours, and I have seen what they've done with their yard. And they did use a number of traditional plants, but they've also snuck in quite a few native plants, which you typically don't see on a house like this. This large tree over here on the left in the courtyard between the house and the garage, is a native sweet bay magnolia. And there are places where they've used a number of non-natives. But what she has done is, where she could, she created this series of formal walls and formal pathways to give the house a very traditional Williamsburg English garden, but also Sonoma, California, where they lived for many years, kind of a look. And then she carved out these large areas, which she has filled with perennials and native plants. So she has a combination of both, lots of beautiful structure and lots of herbs and wonderful perennials. This is a different spot in the garden. Again, the beautiful structural brick walls are just spectacular. And you can see in one of her little you can see the courtyard that you can see against the house in the picture on the left. The close-up on the right, she's got it filled with bee balm. She's got yarrow, coneflower, and on the wall, she has a tiny little fountain. So there's a beautiful urn, a classic kind of European-looking urn that catches the water. It spits out of the fountain's mouth. So she has this trickling running water sound, which again attracts the birds and the bees from all over. It's a beautiful, beautiful garden. Now, if you happen to have a large property and you live out in the country, you can do bigger things. You could do a wildlife meadow in your property. Kelray Farm is a lovely farm not far from us. They are wonderful neighbors of ours here in Toano. They have a CSA. They have a wonderful food hub where you can order food online and pick it up at the farm once a week. But they also have bees, so they're very interested in having pollinators around to pollinate all their crops, and also to provide nectar for the bees. So they have a half acre, couple of acre spots here and there in their property. They got a grant a few years ago to put in a wildflower meadow on the property, and it's lovely to see when it's blooming. So if you're ever out in Toano, go by and take a look at Kelray Farm. You're welcome anytime to go out and walk around. They just ask you if you have dogs, keep your dogs on a leash, because the chickens are running loose, the pet turkeys are running loose. It's just a beautiful place to see where your food is growing. And so feel free to go up. You can take some lovely photos. This they do every year as well. They always have a big field where they plant nothing but sunflowers, which are a tremendous pollinator plant, one of the best to put in your garden. This is annual sunflower. But again, pollinator garden can look like anything. This is my neighbor. We live out in the country. She has a lot of habitat, but wanted a small garden in her front yard. So she created this little enclosed area with some pathways and a seating area, and she fills it with pollinator plants and a birdhouse and a bird bath, and that's her little pollinator garden. I took a tour a few years ago with my VSLD garden colleagues, and we went downtown into Richmond, and there's a neighborhood in Richmond called the Fan District, and it's a neighborhood of old row houses very close together, but they're all connected on the back sides with alleyways. And we walked down this one particular alleyway, and every square inch in the alleyway was filled with plants. It was absolutely spectacular. So, you know, the people in these little neighborhoods have very small yards. So they take advantage of every square inch they have. And you can see here on the right, someone was even keeping bees. This is in the heart of downtown Richmond. So no matter how small your yard is, you can have a habitat and you can even have bees. This is another neighbor right on Route 60 in Toano. If you drive by this house and you're heading up through Toano, you'll see it on the left-hand side. He has cosmos, which reseed themselves every year. And this is what they look like in the height of the summer when they're blooming their little heads off. And I go up and take pictures because he has a lovely little garden in the back with even more than this, smothered in swallowtail butterflies. So if you have a garden, you know, a great way to attract more pollinators is to seed around Cosmo, which will come back every year and reseed to attract butterflies. My neighbor Ann had a large pecan tree, which fell over in a big storm some years ago, but it didn't kill the tree. It just upended the roots. So they piled dirt all over the base of the roots. And Ann's a science teacher, and she decided that she was going to turn that into her pollinator garden. And so she has filled it with all kinds of pollinator plants, and it's full of butterflies all the time. She has bird feeders, and she also has bird baths set around, and her chickens are all over. She gardens completely organically. But anything can become a pollinator garden with a little creativity. And even if you don't have much of a yard and you have the tiniest little space on your deck, you can do something good for pollinators. You can plant something in a container. And again, if you plant it, they will come. This is a simple little container filled with parsley. And parsley is one of the few plants that swallowtails will lay their eggs on, and those are the little swallowtail caterpillars that come out. I always plant enough parsley for both me and the swallowtails, and that's a little pollinator habitat in a container. Don't forget about the Williamsburg Botanical Garden. It's a wonderful place to go and look. It's at the corner of Long Hill and Centerville Road. It's open all year round. The garden's encircled with a tall deer fence to keep out deer. And there are things in that garden that bloom all times of the year. There's an herb garden, a butterfly garden, a native plant garden, any number of different kinds of gardens. So it's a wonderful place to walk around and look. You can see green roofs on the pavilions. But it's a wonderful garden. It's a teaching garden. It's a demonstration garden for the master gardeners. So I invite anybody to please become a member. The Botanical Garden is completely volunteer run. We get no money from the county or the state to keep it up. We rely strictly on donations and volunteers, but people love this little garden, and weddings are held there. Other celebrations. So if you haven't been, be sure to take a visit. On the left-hand side, you'll see in the wintertime, it's just as beautiful. You can see the grasses in the background and winterberry holly in the front. On the right side, this is the herb garden with rosemary in the front and pineapple sage, which is an amazing pollinator plant, in the back. And they also are certified as a monarch way station. They have all of the things needed to sustain monarch butterflies, which is milkweed, nectar sources, and the shelter they need. And you too can have your yard. If you're particularly interested in butterflies or monarchs, you can go on this website, become certified as a monarch way station, take part in the butterfly counts every year, lots of things you can get involved in. And also you can see at the Botanical Garden on the left-hand side, there's a little pollinator palace. These are fun things you can build, especially if you have kids. The whole idea is to use all kinds of natural materials to create little nooks and crannies where all of these native bees and insects and butterflies can lay their eggs, can winter over, can be safe and secure. And there are instructions online if you're interested in building something like this, but they really are fun, and it's a great asset to a little pollinator garden. My little habitat garden, everybody is curious what mine looks like. We live out in the country on almost 5 acres, and my little garden is carved out of a 2-acre horse pasture. And we do not have horses. We don't have animals other than the cats and dogs we had once. So it was a horse pasture that we've mowed for many years, and I'll show you what we've done a little differently. But this is my little habitat garden. It consists of 1,200 square feet. I have 6 200 square foot 10 by 20 raised bed gardens that are a combination of grasses, small shrubs, perennials, and veggies. And I will say this is the first place I come in the summer and the spring in the morning, and it's the last place I come to when I come home at the end of the day. It is just my little piece of heaven where I sit and I meditate and I take photos, and it's just fascinating to me in such a tiny little place, the diversity of wildlife that I see every day. This is my garden in the spring. Again, I have 3 sections. In the middle sections, I do grow or try to grow some vegetables, but it is not fenced in. So I have deer and bunnies, which are constantly an issue. And I garden completely organically. At one point, when our pets had passed away, got so frustrated with voles that I started using vole poison, the green pellets that you can see at every garden store. And they made a tremendous difference in the amount of voles I had in my garden, I will say. But the following spring, I saw a posting online from one of our local veterinarians who was trying to nurse back to health a baby owl who had eaten a vole that was poisoned by poison bait, and it poisoned the baby owl as well, and the owl did eventually die. And, you know, again, I had never made that connection that the critters I'm trying to attract are going to eat other critters in my garden, and the hawks that I love that are after the mice and the voles and the moles and owls. I just decided at that point, never again. I'm not going to use chemical pesticides, and I don't. This is my garden in summer. This is my little garden in the fall, which is my favorite time of the year. It is the most beautiful time, the most number of plants, the most number of birds and butterflies. A fall garden is absolutely the best. And because I garden in the country to begin with, and I'm planting organically, and I have a diversity of plants, and I put out loads of bird feeders and bird baths, I have lots and lots of wildlife in my garden. I have loads of these hawks, which we absolutely adore. We have these amazing turkey vultures, which love to sun themselves on our little barn roof. We have hummingbirds galore. We have loads of butterflies. And again, I use both natives and non-natives. And I know that's a very controversial subject in the horticulture world these days. But again, pollinator plants, pollinators love things like butterfly bush. I have never found butterfly bush here to be invasive like it may be other places. So I continue to use it, and I find butterfly bush is a wonderful plant to get people interested in pollinators. it attracts more butterflies almost than anything very quickly. So that to me as an educator gets people interested in pollinators, and then I start to introduce them to the other native plants that they can use in their gardens. Bees, loads of bees, all kinds of bees, native bees. I have friends who are beekeepers who live in different places down the road, so we have lots of honeybees, but also all kinds of unusual bees. I have wonderful moths, loads of little frogs and toads, praying mantis. A lot of people don't know what a praying mantis egg case looks like. There it is on the left. And you see those in the winter. We've even often bought Christmas trees that have praying mantis egg cases attached. And when I see that, I cut it out of the Christmas tree, I tie it into a shrub on my property. And if you've ever seen a praying mantis egg case hatch, it is the most amazing thing. All of a sudden, one day, it just kind of opens up and hundreds, if not thousands, of these teeny tiny little praying mantises pour out of it. It's just hilarious to watch. You just have to be there at the right time. And of course, many, many, many butterflies of all shapes, sizes, and species. And I'm trying to teach myself the names of all of them. Of course, I also have black snakes. In the years we've been here, I've only seen one copperhead, but we do have loads of black snakes, but they do control voles and mice, and we're very happy to have them, although they can be a scare. We feed the birds, so we have loads of squirrels, adorable to watch, but they can be very frustrating and destructive. They've chewed one of my garden benches that I've had for years, and I'm very angry with the squirrels right now, but they are adorable. And this is what my backyard looks like on any given night. So we have fencing around the pasture, but the deer hop right over it. And so I deal with deer always. And I have learned to live in peace with them because I'd rather have the deer than not have the deer. And I've learned to plant things that typically they stay away from. This is the bigger picture of my yard. When I started getting interested in pollinators, I would say maybe about 10 years ago, our pasture looked like everybody else's on the road. My husband spent hours every weekend mowing it. And not every weekend, every few weekends. It was neat and tidy and it looked like mowed grass. And we did that for many years. And then the more I started getting interested in this, I started realizing we weren't doing the right thing. So we started along the road and I planted along the roadside a pollinator habitat, and wild Queen Anne's lace popped up, and I planted the black-eyed Susans, and they were spectacular. Unfortunately, I fight with VDOT every few years. They decide it's time to mow. They apparently cannot tell a wildflower habitat from a messy yard, so they mow it, and they haven't done it for years, but came back and did it again this year. Much to my great frustration, even though we have 2 signs out there that say, please do not mow. So we have reseeded again, and we're hoping for the best this year. So we had such interest in what we were doing out there. I had people stopping and sending me notes that I didn't even know, people who would drive by and say, we love what you're doing with your yard. I decided with my husband's, it took him a while to get him on board, but I said, let's just stop mowing and see what happens. Well, this is what happened. This is our pasture in the spring. We mow it late in the spring now, not early in the spring, but we let all the wildflowers and the buttercups pop up. It looks spectacularly beautiful. And when they're all finished, that part we mow. This is the back pasture, the big pasture, which is 2 acres. And again, we stopped mowing that. And the first few years we had a lot of weedy invasives. This is it's a native, but we're not fond of it. So we very carefully with Roundup took that out. But over the years, native grasses have popped up, lots of native plants. My husband still was not 100% sold. He thought it looked awfully messy. So we finally compromised by mowing big pathways down the middle and keeping the edges mowed nicely. And that made all the difference in the world. And all of a sudden we discovered we have this beautiful habitat we can walk through every morning. These native grasses have popped up. Every year I throw out seeds for native perennials. More and more we see every year. The first year we did it, for the first time ever in all the years we lived here, we saw 13 wild turkey eggs that hatched, and we were mesmerized. Now we're getting stands of wild yarrow. Blanket flower is taking over. This is what it looks like in the fall. I think this is beautiful. I have neighbors who do not, but we do. We let the grass stay all fall and winter until probably March, early March, and then we mow it all back and we let it start all over again to keep the weeds down. This is what it looks like in the winter, and then you can see every day we walk through it. This is our morning walk almost every morning. If you get nothing more from this talk, I would ask you please consider planting more native plants in your yard. Dr. Doug Tallamy wrote a life-changing book for me, I would say a few years ago, called Bringing Nature Home. He has a new one called Nature's Best Hope. And you can see him online. I would say read his books. They take a very complex topic and make it simple. And you can hear him talk. He's all over YouTube. If you Google his name, he's a very, very good speaker. And it makes you understand so clearly why the native insects and birds that we prize have evolved with the native plants and species that have grown up around them forever, and why it is so important for us to keep that habitat going and add to it. So please read that. Dr. Tallamy determined by his studies, and he's a lepidopterist, his specialty is butterflies, moths, caterpillars. If you did one thing in your yard to plant the #1 plant that attracted the most species of moths and butterflies, it would be to plant an oak tree. 534 different species are attracted by oak trees, followed by cherry, willow, birch, poplar, crabapple, blueberry, maple, and elm. And I will say, in all my years of landscape design, almost never have I had a client ask if I would plant one of these plants in their yard. And I'm hoping that will change. Some plants I recommend, now talking about plants, if you want to plant some great native plants in your yard, Virginia native red cedar. Wonderful plant for birds, has great berries. If you need a big screening evergreen, this is a wonderful plant. Sweet bay magnolia, a great native magnolia for us, loves damp or wet spaces, not nearly as big as southern magnolia. That's a wonderful plant. Yaupon holly on the right. Yaupons are native. There are big ones and small ones. The larger ones get beautiful red berries, which the birds love. Bayberry wax myrtle, wonderful, probably attracts more varieties of birds than any other plant. Some get very large, but there are also some smaller varieties as well. A wonderful plant to plant for diversity. Clethra blooms with very fragrant white flowers in the summer, a very pretty, really a plant you can use as a foundation plant. It's a very pretty little garden plant. Also likes some wet areas. And 9-bark, very interesting, comes in different colors, looks a little like a spirea, I would say. Very interesting native plant. Itea, this is a great plant. I love it because not only does it have fragrant, beautiful flowers that pollinators love in the summer, the fall color is spectacular. And I love fall. I think it's the most beautiful time in the yard, so I'm always interested in beautiful fall color. St. John's wort on the left, Hypericum, great flowers. On the right, native beautyberry, and be careful, there's a lot of beautyberry being sold at garden centers that is Asian. It is not the native. It's very pretty, but if you want the native, you have to be very specific and ask for it. Buttonbush, a great butterfly attractant. Abelia and butterfly bush, not native plants. but wonderful pollinators smothered in butterflies and insects. I love the native grasses. This is my favorite, panicum. This one is Shenandoah, turns beautiful red in the fall and is one of the smaller varieties. The perennials, all sorts of wonderful perennials. The #1 perennial is goldenrod on the left. It is not allergenic like most people think it is. There are many types of goldenrod. There's a whole goldenrod garden at the Botanical Garden that you can see. It attracts unbelievable numbers of pollinators and is Doug Tallamy's #1 pick. New England asters bloom in the fall, another fabulous one. These are the plants that are feeding the butterflies as they're getting ready to make their migrations other places. So that's when they really need to fill up on special foods. Anise hyssop, anything in the herb family. Insects are attracted to herbs. Hyssop is a fabulous one. There are many different varieties of it, and it's a beautiful garden plant. Basil on the right, I love basils, and they are always smothered in bees. Mountain mint, it's in the mint family, a lovely fragrance. I would say I see more different species of really unusual little plants on this plant than anything else I have in my garden. It spreads, it's kind of vigorous, but it's easy to pull out if it's in places you don't want it. Obedient plant on the left, and Joe Pye weed on the right. Wonderful plants. Joe Pye gets very large. There's a dwarf one as well. If you have moist or damp areas, especially near wetlands or a pond, it's a wonderful plant. And at the end of the summer, covered in butterflies. Lots of native perennial and annual sunflowers. People don't realize there's helianthus and heliopsis, long blooming garden plants. Deer are more attracted to the helianthus, the true sunflowers. I tend to use the heliopsis, which are the false sunflowers, but they bloom for months and months at a time. I love them in my garden, and they make great cut flowers, and the birds love them too. Morning glory and native honeysuckle, wonderful plants. Black-eyed Susans and coneflowers. I have very little luck with coneflowers in my yard. I think it's because I have voles, and I think in the winter the voles eat the roots as they do daisies. I have a terrible time with daisies. I think it's the voles, but I have clients who can do a fabulous job with them. Probably my #1 favorite is the native cutleaf coneflower, the Rudbeckia laciniata. Gets very tall. It blooms like you see on the left. In the middle of the summer, I cut it back. It blooms again. And then in the fall, I leave the cones on all winter long, and the birds pick at them all winter. So it has flowers in the summer for the pollinators and cones in the fall and winter for the birds. And of course, milkweed. Milkweed is important because monarch butterflies lay their eggs on no other plant but milkweed. They drink much nectar from many different pollinators, including non-native plants, but the only plant they lay their eggs on is milkweed. So if the milkweed disappears, the monarchs will disappear. And that is part of the problem. And the reason that monarchs are disappearing is because, as I said earlier, in many of the states in the center of the country, their habitat has been taken over by thousands of acres of farmland, which is totally sprayed out the milkweed. There is no more milkweed there for them, and they don't have the habitat to survive that they did. And it isn't just monarchs that love milkweed. Bees, wasps, all other insects love milkweed. Daisies and coreopsis. Columbine, very early pollinator, comes very early in the spring. So it's important to have that when other things are not blooming. That's the native bee balm on the right, the fistulosa. That's the true native, although the pollinators love every other variety, but this is the true native form. This is a wonderful garden phlox. Most garden phlox are native. This one is Gina, has tiny little flowers, smothered in pollinators and butterflies all summer long. A wonderful plant. Anything in the salvia and herb family, verbenas are wonderful. This was a new plant to me a few years ago called silphium or cup plant. Very tall, it probably gets 8 feet tall, blooms late summer, early in the fall. And when it blooms, it is smothered in butterflies. Annual sunflowers, and I mix annuals and perennials together. If you have big spaces, put the tall ones, but there's this wonderful small bushy Mexican sunflower, very easy to grow from seed. People always ask me, what is this plant? And they come down the driveway and, you know, they'll leave me a little note and say, can you call me and let me know? But I grow it from seed. It comes in yellow and orange, and it is smothered in pollinators all year round. Another fabulous plant is lantana. There is one true hardy lantana. That is this one, Miss Huff Hardy. Most of the lantana are annual plants. They die. It's too cold here for them in the winter. They won't come back. But this Miss Huff has come back for me every year. Unfortunately, it gets really big. It's too big for many people's gardens. It gets 5 or 6 feet wide and probably 5 or 6 feet tall. You can keep it cut way back, but this, I would say, is next to the mountain mint. I see more butterflies. I see more wasps and unusual bees on the mountain mint, but on the lantana, I see more butterflies than any other plant. I love this little marigold. You can only get it from seed. It's called France's Choice. It's an old, kind of a wild marigold variety. It does tend to reseed itself. It's very tall, so it's great in a flower arrangement. Small flower heads, but lots of them, covered with pollinators in my yard. And anything in the zinnia family, they love it. And again, plant lots of parsley for the swallowtails. So again, just to recap, what can you do? I know I'm running out of time. We want to start thinking about, instead of selecting plants just for decoration and to make our yards look pretty, we need to be thinking about choosing plants for their utility to wildlife and the ecosystem, and what we can do to make the planet a better place. Minimize your lawn. If you have big spaces, use meadows. Eliminate the lawn if possible, but if not, make it as small as possible. Use native plants and species adapted to your local soil climate and wildlife. Recycle, use your leaves. Allow the dead vegetation in beds to remain. It used to be that we always were told, clean up your garden beds in the fall. Now biologists are telling us, don't do that anymore. Let the leaves, let the dead plants, let everything sit all winter long. Clean it out in late winter, very early spring. It gives those pollinators a chance to finish their life cycle and keep going. Keep a few dead trees on your property. If you have a big property, you don't have to take out every dead tree. Many insects, many birds live in snags or dead trees. And again, leave big buffers around natural water areas. Plant brush piles, rock piles, add nesting boxes, bird baths, and water features. And again, get inspired. There are wonderful books on the market that you can read that can teach you more about all of this. This is an amazing book, especially if you have children or grandchildren. His whole takeaway message is, if young children are not exposed to nature when they are young, when they get older, they're not going to notice when it disappears. Chilling message, but true. There are wonderful resources available. This is my little native plant Bible. The series of books that are published for the whole of Virginia. They are available. I think Judith is going to post an availability listing. Some garden centers, places that specialize in native plants, have this plant, or there are places you can find it online. You can get certified. Again, very easy to certify your yard. If you're interested in becoming a wildlife habitat, simple paperwork, a little bit of money, and then you buy a beautiful sign. So I want to thank everybody very much for your patience and sitting through an hour and a half of me talking, and I'll be happy to field some questions. And I'm going to let Judith take over now, and she'll let me know if there were any questions.
All right, Peggy, we are getting lots of wonderful, thank you, excellent presentation. I'm going to suggest you stop sharing your screen.
Okay.
Okay. And we do have a few questions.
Okay.
Let me pull this up. Whoops, wait a minute. I hate when that happens. All righty. Okay. So, and I'm going in chronological order. Peggy, where do you find native plants? Pineland was a resource, but since
Yeah,
uh,
it's getting a little easier to get native plants, but you still have to ask. Garden centers and nurseries sell what people ask for. And so when you go into a nursery and garden center, let them know you want more native plants, and hopefully they will get them. Pinelands used to be available. They were more for big reclamation projects. They're no longer in the area with an outlet. But I would say some of the places in the Williamsburg area.
I have some recommendations.
Ulster Homestead Garden Center
Yes.
has they have a fairly good number of pollinator plants, and if you ask, they will try to get more for you. Coleman Nursery as well. They're getting more and more. They're on Ironbound. They're having more and more native plants. Ask your local landscape nursery, your landscape person, people who work in your yards. Sandy's plants, if you're looking for small plants like perennials, Sandy's plants in
Oh, it's north.
Mechanicsville.
Yeah.
I kept Midlothian and Mechanicsville confused. In Mechanicsville, fabulous little place to go. It's set up for wholesale nursery, but if you go up there, you can walk in and she will sell to anybody. You get on a golf cart. You go into the sales office, they kind of will give you a map of where things are. You get in the golf carts and you go. They're not set up to hold your hand and walk around and show you things, but it is strictly perennials, and they have more varieties of perennials than anybody I've seen, and a tremendous amount of native plants. You can also get a lot online as well.
And if I may add a couple of things, the Virginia Living Museum has a native plant sale twice a year.
Correct.
The Botanical Garden will have, we are not doing a one-day plant sale. We are going to do what we did last year, which is to have an honor box, and there will be a lot of native plants. I recommend you check out the John Clayton chapter of the Native Plant Society, because they are going to have an internal native plant sale. So you have to be a member to be involved in that.
The same with Master Gardeners. I think theirs will only be an internal sale.
There will be an internal. We hope that that the garden will be able to do what we did last year. Now, this is not a promise, which is that we took in the remainder of what they had available and put it out in our honor box, but that has not been arranged yet this year. Let's see, going on. And unfortunately, another great source, used to be a great source for native plants, was Sassafras Farms, and that is no longer available.
Well, someone is supposedly taken over Denise's business and going to be also selling natives. I have not heard yet what's happening there.
Yeah, they weren't up and running yet last year. I think that they were kind of rebuilding. So, you know, we will stay in touch for that. Okay, let's see. And Peggy Fox from Newport News made the comment, even as talking about natives in the design, even as recently as 8 years ago, natives were not the norm in designer training sessions. If you are not muted, please mute, because we are getting feedback. And also there's a dog barking, I believe. Question, when you are using leaves for mulch, do the leaves need to be chopped, or can you leave them as they are? Do they suffocate the perennials? Do they get too wet?
Yeah. I would say if you have big areas, like big natural areas, we blow all we let them fall and stay in the big natural areas, and some we blow in. In my garden beds, though, I do shred them, and it's probably not the best thing in the world for all the little creatures hiding in them. but we do shred them and put them in piles, and then we spread them shredded. When they're shredded, they don't blow around as much, and they also are much lighter in weight. They can, if you have thick layers of wet leaves, they can get thick and heavy. Eventually they will break down, but I think still they're better than heavy hardwood shredded mulch, which really often gets very thick and crusty and you just can't break through it. So I recommend to all my clients, leaves or shredded leaves are always the best mulch, especially for perennial beds.
Okay, very good. And then the comments, fabulous presentation, etc. Great, thank you. Thank you, your winter pastures. Somebody's going to be abstracting your pastures into some paintings. Great presentation, wonderful, wonderful. And then this is one of the nicest. Wow, I can't believe that was 90 minutes. I could have listened all day.
Well, I probably could have talked all day, so you're lucky Judith clipped it off at 90 minutes.
I understand. Get me talking about butterflies and it's like, oh my God.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think we will hold on. I think we're going to call it. I don't see any other questions. But thank you, everyone, for participating. We'll send out the follow-up email in within 48 hours. So,
Well, thank you very much, everyone who came, and I hope everybody learned a little something that you can take home to your own yard or your HOA or your neighbors, and convince them that my little saying I like to say is, no one of us can save the world, but we can all do a little something. And so if we all just do some little something in our own backyards, hopefully it will make a difference.
all right. Thanks, everyone. Take care. Have a great weekend. Thank you, Peggy.